The Russian Civil War was one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century, not for the size of its battles, but for the conditions that soldiers were forced to fight and live in. Material deprivations combined with a deep hatred of the other meant that this was a conflict in which no quarter was given. The main factions of the Civil War can be boiled down to the Bolsheviks and the White Armies. The Bolsheviks found their main base of support in the proletariat. These urban workers had been radicalized over years of oppression, were sufficiently educated to form an idea on how the world should work, and generally committed to seeing Russia become communist. On the side of the Whites, we had the bourgeois, aristocrats, landlords, and Cossacks who were all unwilling to give up their properties and privileges. Suffice to say, both sides were too different to ever get along, and vilified one another to no end. However, these core followers were nowhere near large enough to take over Russia. The rank and file of World War I went back home with a few exceptions. This basically meant that both sides had to establish massive armies from the ground up in a country that was already exhausted from war. When the Bolsheviks made a call for volunteers in early 1918, they expected hundreds of thousands of workers to enlist, but what they got was not as numerous as they had hoped for, and many of these recruits were, in Trotsky's words, vagabonds, unstable elements that were so numerous at times. It was the poor, the desperate, and the outright criminal that were the first to enlist. The Whites were even worse off, failing to recruit even the most destitute of Russians. As a result, all sides are forced to conscript masses of peasants. The Russian peasantry was generally ignorant of the wider world and largely concerned with situations in their own village. After years of war, they were unwilling to run around Russia fighting for a cause that they didn't believe in or even understood. Those conscripted into the Red Army were often looked down upon by their commanders of proletarian origin, who resented their backwards way of life. Discipline was harsh, and peasant conscripts were often beaten into submission by their superiors. The Whites, at the very least, started the Civil War with a few regiments of disciplined veterans with a savage hatred for the Bolsheviks. But these weren't enough. Just like the Reds, they conscripted peasants, and their treatment was no better. The Whites felt no obligation to accept the agrarian revolution and concede to the peasantry the land that they had already taken. Instead of persuading them to join with even the vaguest of promises of reform, peasants were often threatened at gunpoint to enlist. Hostages were taken, prisoners were executed, men pulled off the streets and flogged into serving a cause that they could care less about. Traditional discipline from the Tsarist army was also reintroduced, which meant that soldiers could be smacked or even whipped by their officers, even for minor infractions. Unlike the Whites, the Bolsheviks suffered from a lack of officers needed to organize the Red Army. Attempts were made to convince them to volunteer as specialists, but promises of world revolution and a paycheck weren't always enough. Many Tsarist officers were forced to serve in the Red Army after their families had been taken hostage. Therefore, it should be of no surprise to learn that 1 out of 3 military specialists would desert the Red Army over the course of the Civil War. Desertion was a major issue for every major faction in the Civil War, and was often triggered when times became tough. In Ukraine, for example, there were instances when the same peasants served in the Red, White, and Ukrainian armies. When the Red Army captured Lenin's home city of Simbirsk, the men of the People's Army defected en masse to join the Bolsheviks or to head home. After Kolchak's offensive had failed and the Bolsheviks counterattacked, his army began to rapidly collapse as his soldiers attempted to save their own skin. General Knox of the British Army commented that 80% of White Army recruits, armed and clothed with British aid, would desert to the Bolsheviks with all their gear the moment they got the chance. When the Red Army captured Krasnoyarsk, a British diplomat that had been left behind noted that 1 in 4 Red Army men were fully kitted out in British khaki. If that wasn't bad enough, many white soldiers intentionally injured themselves so that they'd be withdrawn from the front. In fact, it was acknowledged by General Kappel that the units with the highest incidence of self-inflicted wounds were those that should have been a leading example for the rest. Marching home or joining the enemy wasn't always without consequences. Though a work of fiction, Red Cavalry by Isaak Bábel is based off of the author's experiences during the Polish-Soviet War. One of his stories is about a young Cossack. The man had initially fought for the Whites before defecting to the Red Army. In revenge, the White Army murdered his mother and father, and his neighbors looted all their possessions. When he made it back home, the Cossack went door to door and took back what was his, killing those who had stolen from his parents. Knowing what we do about the Civil War, it's probable that stories like these are grounded in reality. As the Whites and Reds drastically expanded their armies, they found themselves in a brutal cycle of forced conscription and desertion. As armies grew larger, they began to suffer from problems with supply, training, and indiscipline. On top of that, many peasant recruits often wanted to go home during the agricultural season. The material conditions of the Civil War meant that life in the army was very brutal. There simply weren't enough resources to properly maintain so many soldiers, which explains why desertion was so common. Though all major factions tried to equip their troops with standardized uniforms, the men at the front often had to wear whatever was at hand. That's if there was anything available at all. There are plenty of images of Civil War combatants dressed in a mix of military surplus and civilian clothes. In this image, you can see soldiers of Kolchak's army equipped with a variety of hats, a few different shirts, and torn-up trousers, all of whom appear to be in dire need of a bath. In this image, you can see Red Army troops on parade. What caught my attention was the use of traditional peasant footwear called lapti, a sort of slipper made from plant fibers that wasn't all that durable for military use. However, it could get much worse. In this image of Red Army troops, you can see that many of them, aside from their tattered clothes, aren't even wearing shoes. When Denikin's Moscow offensive ran out of steam, Lieutenant General Holman of the British Army wrote him a furious letter, complaining about the state of his troops. Despite the British handing out 200,000 pairs of uniforms, Holman noted that many soldiers he saw were dressed in rags and without boots. Jackets meant to protect them from the cold and rain had also disappeared. Aside from their inability to distribute supplies, this was also the result of rampant corruption. White officers, who were not even paid enough to survive, resorted to selling off equipment meant for the front at the expense of the soldiers. As a result, Denikin's men resorted to pillaging and looting. Unsurprisingly, pillaging wasn't just about survival. Soldiers on all sides did it to satisfy their own greed at the expense of innocent civilians. Some of the worst pillages were committed by Denikin's Cossacks. The Cossacks, who had a distinct sense of national identity, had little respect for non-Cossack peasants and ruthlessly sacked their villages for anything of value. So much loot had been taken that whole units were unable to fight because their supply wagons and trains were filled with stolen goods. Not only that, but thousands of Cossacks deserted and took their loot back home. Industrial production had taken a massive hit during the Civil War. The Whites had almost no industry to speak of and were reliant on the Allies for aid. Bolshevik management of the economy was incredibly inefficient. Yet, since they controlled much more developed territory, the Reds had a slight advantage. However, one advantage the Whites did have was that they controlled many of Russia's grain-producing regions and had less mouths to feed. With no major backers, the Bolsheviks had to figure out a way to arm themselves. Acquiring enough rifles and ammunition wasn't always easy. Peasant rebels were especially desperate. In this photo, we can see a peasant during the Tambov uprising equipped with what appears to be a musket, while another man is missing a leg. In this depiction of the West Siberian uprising, we can see that one peasant doesn't even have a gun, but instead is armed with a pitchfork. The Bolsheviks had control of a few important weapon factories, notably the Tula arsenal. The city was so important that when the Whites threatened to capture it, Trotsky claimed that it was more important than Moscow itself. Despite the Tula arsenal's best efforts to produce weapons and ammunition, most of this had to be acquired from old Tsarist stockpiles. Prior to the Civil War, the Tsarist army had acquired about 11 million rifles, but when the Bolsheviks took over, only 5 to 10% of these had survived and remained in their hands. It was estimated that the Red Army possessed at the start of 1919 only 600,000 rifles. Because of the lack of equipment and lack of infrastructure, the ratio of combat troops was only 1 to 4. Therefore, many Red Army soldiers were given jobs behind the front. Soldiers on all sides were constantly short on practically everything they needed and resorted to using whatever was at hand. Feeding all these soldiers proved to be difficult. The lack of proper supply systems meant that many units had to acquire their own food. Red Army regiments in the rear often procured their own food from civilians, or even resorted to growing their own. On the front, Red Army soldiers had no choice but to steal from peasants to feed themselves, and even ship food back into the Russian core. It should be of no coincidence that the most affected regions by the 1921 famine were those pillaged by the Bolsheviks for their grain. In some cases, the Bolsheviks even seized the whole harvest and the reserves for the next season, leaving the peasants to starve. Rebelling was no longer a choice but a necessity for survival. From the Ukrainian steppe to the Volga, perhaps hundreds of thousands of peasants, many of whom were young men dressed in rags, revolted against the Bolsheviks. Lenin was especially frustrated by the resistance put up by the peasants and responded with extreme brutality. The requisition brigades resorted to torturing peasants to reveal where they were hiding their stockpiles, that's if they had any at all. The peasants responded likewise. Bolsheviks that they killed would be cut open and stuffed with grain as a warning for those who sought to steal from them. If caught alive, then their fate was particularly nasty. It is important to consider that many of these peasants were the families of Red Army soldiers. In fact, the brutal treatment of the peasantry by the Bolsheviks was one of the causes of the Kronstadt Mutiny. Regardless of what side they fought for, soldiers in the Civil War couldn't even rest easy knowing that their families were taken care of. Though the Bolsheviks made it illegal to requisition grain from the relatives of soldiers, the reality is that it likely happened anyways. After everything Red Army soldiers had been through, everything that they had sacrificed, they were brutalized by the same government they helped put in power. As with food supply, medical treatment was also lacking. If sick or injured, treatment was limited and primitive. Referring again to Denikin's Moscow offensive, British observers were horrified by the poor state of military hospitals. There was a shortage of beds, forcing the sick and the wounded to lay on the floor. The British later found out that the hospital beds and even nurse outfits had been stolen by corruption. To quote one angry British officer, "Not a single bed ever reached its destination. Beds, blankets, sheets, mattresses, and pillows disappeared as of magic. They found their way into the houses of staff officers and members of the government." It shouldn't be a stretch to say that the Whites cared little for their men. Out of a peak combat strength of 100,000, a horrifying 42,700 of Denikin's soldiers were either sick or injured with typhus. The British mission wrote the following: "Probably no army has ever been so handicapped from a medical point of view." Conditions within the Red Army weren't much better, though at least corruption appears to have been less severe. Red Army men, just like their enemies, had to contend with a myriad of diseases, including, but not limited to, typhus, influenza, smallpox, cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, skin rashes, toothache, stomach bugs, and a variety of STDs. It is likely that between 10 and 15% of men in a unit could be afflicted with one of these at any given time. Worse yet, it wasn't uncommon for up to 80% of men in a unit to be ill. Soap was a rarity, and living conditions were deplorable. Given the, at times, rapid changes in the front line, men were constantly on the move and could go weeks without showering. It also made it difficult to set up proper field hospitals, and the shortage of medical supplies and qualified personnel didn't help either. Suffice to say, many, if not most soldiers in the Civil War didn't want to be there. Historian Adam Zamoyski gives an excellent comment on the sad reality of a soldier during this conflict. The average Red Army ranker was a drafted peasant who might have survived a couple of murderous campaigns of the Great War, then been caught up in the barbarous maelstrom of the Civil War, who did not know what he was fighting for or why, who was dressed in rags, covered in lice, suffered from chronic diarrhea, was perpetually hungry, and above all, scared, and who expressed his fear and sense of deprivation by raping and killing anyone he perceived as being with the enemy and defiling anything he could not possess. Unlike in World War I, the front line of the Civil War didn't constitute a line of trenches between opposing forces. More often than not, armies would focus their efforts on holding key positions. This was because armies were much smaller, and Russia was simply too massive, meaning that there was almost always a gap at the front. Holding positions was made even more difficult at the start of the Civil War because of several weaknesses in the opposing armies. Bolshevik forces consisted mostly of poorly trained workers and peasants, relying on numbers to overcome the enemy, while the Whites, though better trained and led, were hopelessly outnumbered. The first Bolshevik campaigns against the Cossacks, the Ukrainians, and the Volunteer Army was fought almost exclusively along the rail lines. The Reds, lacking any cavalry of their own, loaded trains of as many fighters as possible and headed for enemy territory. Rather than battles, combat consisted mostly of skirmishes along the rail tracks. Once an enemy had been beaten, the Bolsheviks would continue their advance until the next station, after which they would repeat the process all over again. During the ice march of the Volunteer Army, the Whites held no ground of their own and were constantly on the move. When a village was captured, it was soon abandoned as they kept fleeing south. They fought multiple small battles against the Reds, whose only purpose was to keep them alive another day. At this stage, the Whites were basically running for their lives. Control over Russia's limited infrastructure was the only way to move thousands of soldiers and equipment over vast distances and difficult terrain. When Tukhachevsky's men attempted to capture Simbirsk from Komuch, they first had to secure a 1,000-yard-long railway bridge that stretched over the Volga. They captured it by first sending an unmanned train, presumably to distract the enemy and clear obstacles, followed by an armored train with an infantry brigade. However, Komuch forces later recaptured it and blew up part of the bridge, hampering Red Army supply lines east of the Volga for several months. Whether an offensive was successful wasn't always determined by the quality and even quantity of soldiers, but more so on the weaknesses of the enemy. When Kolchak launched his spring offensive, his armies were successful beyond prediction, but this was only because Red forces in the area had been neglected. In a conversation between an officer and a cadet, the officer said the following: "Don't think that our successful advances are a result of military prowess, for it is much simpler than that. When they run away, we advance. When we run away, they will advance." It was of incredible importance for Kolchak to hold some sort of natural defensive barrier like the Urals. Lakes, rivers, mountains, and forests made for great obstacles in a war where infrastructure was poor and armies moved along predictable paths. After the Red Army crossed the Urals, Kolchak's forces attempted to encircle the Red forces in proximity to Chelyabinsk. What ensued was one of the largest battles of the Civil War, costing the Red Army 15,000 casualties and the Whites 5,000. The encirclement failed as it was too complex for the undertrained White Army to pull off. Most embarrassing for Kolchak was the fall of his capital, Omsk. The 30,000-strong garrison and all their equipment was taken without a fight. Kolchak's army didn't just collapse, it metaphorically melted away as retreating soldiers deserted en masse when passing through their native provinces or joined the Reds before shooting their officers. As the Whites retreated, they were increasingly harassed by partisans, often called Greens. These bands of partisans were made up of deserters, peasants, and a handful of Red Army men who had snuck into the taiga. The partisans focused their efforts on destroying rail infrastructure, disrupting vital supplies for Kolchak's front. Thousands of White soldiers were diverted to combat these insurgents. The Whites waged a brutal counterinsurgency, executing dozens of hostages and burning down whole villages. When the Bolsheviks were dealing with their own rebels during the Tambov Rebellion, the rebellious peasants used speed to their advantage, literally running circles around the Red Army. Their knowledge of the terrain made mobility even quicker, allowing them to attack at a moment's notice before fading away into thin air. It was ultimately these peasants that cut off the Trans-Siberian Railway, trapping Kolchak between them and the Red Army. Kolchak was then captured and subsequently executed. Just like the Volunteer Army in early 1918, what remained of Kolchak's army embarked on their long walk, the so-called Great Siberian Ice March. But it was only great in name. There was no glory, only horror as people in their thousands succumbed to the Siberian winter. With the railways clogged up, the men quite literally had to march to Transbaikal. The Red Army started to conquer Siberia at a rapid pace, as the Whites, disorganized and weakened by typhus, couldn't establish a proper defensive line. When partisans rose up in the city of Krasnoyarsk, they cut off the White retreat and took 60,000 prisoners. General Kapo led what remained on sleighs to Lake Baikal before he himself died of frostbite. The survivors carried out a pitiful existence until they were ultimately crushed by the Reds in 1922. The Siberian campaigns of 1919 were characterized by rapid advances, followed by drastic changes in fortune, with territory changing hands multiple times, whilst partisans harassed armies from the rear. One moment victory may seem inevitable, the next you're retreating across Asia. It was very common for armies to overextend themselves and have to give up all the progress they had made. This was best demonstrated during Denikin's Moscow offensive. Everything was lost once his troops could no longer hold on to the ground they had taken, collapsing under the weight of the Red counterattack and poor logistics. The civil war in Ukraine is worthy of its own separate reflection. Between the Ukrainians, the Germans, the Poles, the French, the Bolsheviks, the Whites, the anarchists, and an assortment of minor warlords, Ukraine was one of the most fought over territories of the whole war. It was occupied and reoccupied on multiple occasions. No faction had time to establish a proper administration, and if they did, it was destroyed shortly after. As a result, the country became a free-for-all, a brutal fight for power and survival. The rule of law was basically non-existent, and banditry was a serious problem. Even for the standards of the Civil War, conditions were awful. Though often considered a separate war, the Polish-Soviet War was technically part of the broader Civil War, and the struggle for the borderlands shares a lot in common with those in Russia. The immense size of the borderlands meant that it was impossible to garrison it efficiently, limiting armies to key strategic positions such as towns and rivers. Railways were just as important for communication and supplies. Battles were rare, at least at the beginning, and skirmishes were more common. Units followed the few available roads from one town to another. So long as they kept up the momentum, the enemy could be outflanked and forced to retreat. But if an offensive stopped, then it was almost impossible to hold a thin line against an enemy counterattack. As historian Evan Maudsley points out, the Civil War was fought largely with 19th century technology. The only main exception was minimal, due to backwardsness and the lack of fuel. The conditions of the roads limited usefulness of the few armored cars, and the Tsarist army had no tanky. In a way, the Russian Civil War was a quite primitive conflict, but the lack of technology only meant that generals had to get creative. Armored trains became extremely popular as a means of transport and of a way of bringing heavy firepower to the front. As already mentioned, a lot of the fighting occurred along the railways. Armored trains allowed troops to launch raids into enemy territory and quickly escape, as well as protect them against partisans. There were many of these machines. The one in this photo is named Zamorets and was built by the Tsarist army before the Revolution, and is one of the more advanced models used in the conflict. In 1917, the Bolsheviks briefly used it until it was captured by the Czechoslovaks, traveling across Siberia and later ending up in the hands of Chinese warlords. Many armored trains were much less advanced. In this photo, we can see a French train in North Russia with improvised armor made of logs and a field gun strapped to a flat car. The advanced models had armor made from concrete and steel, while the lesser ones used wood, sandbags, and whatever was available. The Bolsheviks made great use of Central Russia's rail lines to rapidly deploy forces from one front to another. Trotsky himself famously made visits to the front in one of these war machines. In some cases, armored trains were decisive in winning battles. During the Kazan operation, after Bolshevik troops retreated from the battlefield, Trotsky's personal train and bodyguard held off Komuch forces and stopped them from encircling the Red Fifth Army. Though not too common, armored trains from opposing forces did fight from time to time. In Arkhangelsk, the Entente and their Russian allies improvised their own train. The train first went on a reconnaissance mission into no man's land to observe enemy positions. The Poles manned the naval guns, the Russians the Lewis guns, and the French dismounted to cover the flanks. The infantry scouted ahead and reported that an enemy train was further down the line. Both armored trains exchanged shots before retreating. A few days later, the Allied train provided covering fire for a broader offensive, trading shots with its red counterpart. Eventually, the Bolsheviks retreated and tore up the tracks. In another attack, the train's guns were used to clear trees around enemy positions to help with visibility, but to little success. More often than not, people avoided destroying armored trains and preferred to capture them, as these were incredibly valuable. Unsurprisingly, cavalry made a deadly comeback. The thin front lines made for plenty of gaps that could be exploited by horses. Cavalry made up some of the best troops any side could offer. Their ample mobility allowed them to launch daring raids into enemy territory and cut down demoralized peasant soldiers who were unprepared to deal with them. In this photo, we can see white soldiers, presumably the Markovsky regiment, fighting off a cavalry attack. It seems that volley fire from a tight formation was the best way to defend against the enemy. However, getting poorly trained and scared peasants to pull off this formation may have been difficult. If on the defensive, cavalry could quickly respond to enemy incursions. Cavalrymen use weapons including lances, sabers, pistols, and carbines. Rather than attacking in dense clusters, Russian Cossacks used what is called the lava formation. This was a loose formation of a chaotic appearance meant to wrap around the enemy's flanks. Machine guns were also introduced to give cavalry units more firepower. The Whites started off with thousands of Cossacks in their ranks. The Cossacks had a long history of war and basically lived on horseback. They were arguably some of the best cavalrymen in the world. Their horses allowed them to traverse difficult terrain and outflank enemies. However, there were some drawbacks. During their several attempts to capture Hrytsak, the Don Cossacks were unsuited for urban warfare and were forced to fall back. Cavalry units were often supplemented with other vehicles, such as armored cars, to maximize effectiveness. General Maimayevsky of the Volunteer Army was especially innovative. He used aircraft to scout ahead of the main force and would transport his cavalry via train to rapidly deploy them wherever needed. A single unit could then fight in 3 different locations in a single day. One of the greatest displays of cavalry was during the Mamontov raid in August 1919. The Don Cossacks, under General Mamontov, launched a speedy attack into Bolshevik territory and cut their lines of communication. The Black Army of Nestor Makhno also made great use of cavalry and wreaked havoc behind enemy lines. Fighting mostly as guerrillas, Makhno got very creative with his tactics. In 1919, the Black Army took the Ukrainian city of Yekaterinoslav by disguising its soldiers as workers and driving them into the city on a train. Once there, they sprung out and took the city center before withdrawing. The Black Army made great use of horse-drawn carts called tachankas. These 20th century chariots were equipped with a machine gun and crewed by a driver, a gunner, and a rifleman. They allowed for heavy weapons to be brought to the front and could cover a retreat when necessary. Isaak Bábel portrayed the Red Army's struggle against Makhno's insurgents in one of his stories. It is difficult to defeat an enemy like this, and senseless to provoke them into combat. A machine gun hidden in a bunch of hay, a vehicle that can fit into a peasant's barn, is an active combat unit that can disappear. In an hour, Makhno can put together an army like this, with its munitions hidden in every corner, and can make it disappear, again, in less. The Red Army was initially slow to implement cavalry. However, its successful use by the Whites made it clear that they had to act fast. Their most famous cavalry unit was the 1st Cavalry Army commanded by Simeon Budyonny. The Konarmia, as it was called, was the reincarnation of the Mongol horde. Most of its soldiers were poor Cossacks, though pretty much anyone who could ride a horse was welcomed. By sheer force of numbers, the Konarmia trampled to death almost every foe they faced. Just like with their white counterparts, speed was essential. The Konarmia didn't just rely on horses alone, they also utilized several armored trains, artillery, countless tachankas, and even 2 planes. Using speed and numbers, Budyonny would attack the weakest position in the enemy's defenses and push into their rear, wreaking havoc and spreading panic. Despite their intensive use, large-scale cavalry battles weren't all that common during the Civil War. Cavalry was mostly fighting infantry and skirmishing with enemy horsemen. The largest cavalry battle of the Civil War occurred between the Poles and the Soviets during the Battle of Kamarov. Right after the Battle of Warsaw, the Konarmia found itself almost surrounded by the Poles. The Polish cavalry advanced towards the Konarmia's northern flank to encircle them. What ensued was the last cavalry battle in the history of war. Both sides charged at each other and became locked in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. The fighting was exhausting, and the Poles only narrowly avoided defeat. Polish reinforcements led a frontal charge against the Konarmia, catching them off guard and forcing them to flee. Armored vehicles only saw limited use during the Civil War. Imperial Russia had not produced any tanks aside from a prototype, and those given to the White Armies were small in number. The Bolsheviks captured several tanks, notably British ones, but these machines had no effect on their victory. Funnily enough, it seems that captured tanks were more useful as tractors than as fighting vehicles, as seen in this footage right here. Early tanks were incredibly unreliable and required constant maintenance. They were slow and their range was limited, which is an issue when fighting in a massive country like Russia. Tanks constantly broke down, which is how the Red Army captured theirs. They were more of a hindrance to a unit rather than something useful. Armored cars, on the other hand, were generally much better, being a proven technology, and there being many more of them available in Russia. Despite being hindered by the lack of roads, they were still quite mobile, and offered decent firepower and protection. Aircraft also saw limited use, but were much more successful than tanks. Anti-Bolshevik forces were at a clear advantage. The Allies provided them with aircraft and other supplies. The Red Army only had a handful of planes, made even more limited by the lack of pilots. Interestingly, the British Royal Air Force was very active in combat operations in Russia. The RAF attacked the Red Army supply depots, trains, riverboats, and troop concentrations. The lack of proper air defense not only made the Red Army more vulnerable from air attacks, but also seemed to terrify and demoralize them. The Polish Air Force operated off the backs of trains, being pulled from one airfield to another. Aside from reconnaissance, Polish pilots would even land behind enemy lines to gather intel. Cavalry was often easy to detect from the air, as they moved in large groups out in the open. Though valuable at gathering intelligence, aircraft played an insignificant role in combat. Similarly to Russia's rail network, the vast rivers of Eurasia made for natural highways to reach one end to another. The Bolsheviks had the support of thousands of sailors from the Russian Navy, giving them a clear advantage over the Whites. Flotillas were founded on pretty much every body of water, from the Vistula to Lake Baikal. Though dedicated military vessels existed, many were improvised by adding artillery pieces and machine guns to civilian boats. When Czechoslovak and Communist forces revolted against Moscow, the Bolsheviks sent several destroyers from the Baltic Fleet into the Volga, along with smaller vessels. The Volga flotilla allowed for the quick deployment of reinforcements and provided extra firepower, bombing enemy positions and conducting landings. Engagements between opposing flotillas played out like a game of cat and mouse, with both sides peeking out of hiding to take potshots at each other. If the conditions at the front weren't bad enough, it got even worse for soldiers taken prisoner. The vile hatred of the enemy meant that torture and execution for POWs wasn't uncommon. In this photo of Polish prisoners taken by the Red Army, you can see that many of them are without boots. It could be that they just didn't have any, as there are accounts of that happening. However, my personal theory is that they were robbed of them, presumably along with anything else of value. If a prisoner were of some importance, the chances of death increased drastically. The Bolsheviks had a boiling hatred for enemy officers, usually just killing them at every chance. A clean shot was the best they could hope for, but torture and even mutilation was much more likely. Unless in Bolshevik service, Cossacks were automatically targeted as parts of a process called decossacization. This was basically genocide against a whole people and their way of life. After the Bolsheviks recaptured part of the Don in early 1919, they began seizing Cossack land and executing thousands of people. By the time they were done, 12,000 souls, mostly the sick and the elderly, had been murdered. It should be remembered that many Cossacks fought for the Bolsheviks, so you can imagine the internal conflict this must have provoked within them. Surely these crimes explain why so many of them defected when given the chance. Some attempts were made to protect prisoners from being murdered, but these saw little success. To quote a story from Bábel's diary, "The military commissar and I rode along the line, begging the men not to massacre prisoners. The massacres have played a terrible role. I couldn't look at their faces. They bayoneted some, shot others, bodies covered by corpses, they stripped one man while shooting another. Groans, screams, death rattles. It's hell. Our way of bringing freedom. Horrible." On the other hand, the Whites showed no mercy to captured commissars and other enforcers of the Bolshevik regime. The Whites had a special hatred towards Chinese Bolsheviks. It was claimed that they were the worst torturers in the Cheka. Thus, they showed no mercy to any Chinese soldiers they captured. The Don Cossacks were especially brutal. Major Huddleston Williamson recounted one experience after a village had been captured by the Cossacks. Some 300 Red Army men had been taken prisoner. They were terrified, claiming they had been forcibly conscripted, that the Bolsheviks had taken their families hostage, and pleaded for their lives. The next morning, they were all murdered. It was a sickening experience, said Major Williamson. But, as our opinion was never asked, it was wisest to not try to see what happened. Even if an attempt was made to treat enemy prisoners with dignity, it was simply impossible because of the lack of resources. Medical equipment and food were scarce. The fact that soldiers at the front were barely taken care of says all you need to know about prisoners. Hunger and disease were part of the daily life of a Civil War POW, and thousands would die behind barbed wire. Commissars were killed by the whites, officers were killed by the Bolsheviks, and Jews were killed by practically everyone. Anti-Semitism had been a serious problem under the Romanovs and continued well into the Civil War. Approximately 100,000 to 200,000 Jews were slain in these massacres, and many more were injured and forced to flee. The Ukrainians and the whites were the worst offenders. Petliures and disciplined soldiers were rather sloppy at killing Jews. The whites, on the other hand, were much more methodical at their approach. Though the Bolsheviks were not as bad, Red Army forces, notably the 1st Cavalry Army, committed many pogroms. After witnessing many during the Polish campaign, Bábel wrote the following in his diary. "The hatred is the same, the Cossacks just the same, the cruelty the same. It's nonsense to think one army is different from another. Most soldiers of the Civil War likely didn't partake in pogroms, but because they were so common, they were impossible to escape. Whether they witnessed them or simply heard of them, pogroms, along with other massacres, would have contributed to the desensitization of combatants, making them apathetic towards death, or, in the worst of cases, accustomed to murder." When the dust settled, between 7 to 10 million souls were lost during the Russian Civil War. Horrifyingly, only a fraction of these victims were combatants. Most victims were claimed not by battles but from hunger and disease. So devastating was the conflict that pretty much everybody lost someone. To add insult to injury, there was a shortage of coffins and not enough space in the cemeteries to bury the dead. It wasn't uncommon to find bodies lying on the side of the road. Human life was cheap. Everyone from combat veterans to civilians had become desensitized to death and murder. In 1921, the Russian writer Maxim Gorky asked a group of Red Army veterans if killing made them uncomfortable. They said yes, but that at least there would be more land for those who were left. One of these soldiers, a veteran of 2 wars, stated that it was easier to kill other Russians than foreigners. Fighting in the Russian Civil War was an absolute nightmare. In a way, it was borderline apocalyptic. Soldiers were constantly hungry, tired, sick, and afraid of what may happen to them and their families. They were forced to run around a massive country dressed in rags and barefooted. They were mistreated by their superiors and often coerced into fighting against their will. They were forced to risk their lives fighting for a cause that they may not have believed in, nor even understood. The Civil War not only killed millions, but left the survivors traumatized, accustomed to death, and unempathetic to the suffering of their fellow man. It truly was one of the worst conflicts to fight in during recent history. If you made it this far into the video, then thank you for watching. You can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. I also have a Ko-fi page if you would like to donate. I've spent a mini fortune on books that I've used to research subjects, and I intend on buying more. Anyways, thanks for watching, and take care. Goodbye.